free to interrupt me, to ask questions at any time. I mean, I think there'll be time for questions at the end as well, but if there's something as I'm going through, just yeah, feel free to stop me and ask at that time. Last year I was a judge for this public policy case competition, which I think is a fantastic initiative because I mean these days I guess we've got about maybe 6 or 7 case competitions you can do in the faculty, and so that by itself is a fantastic thing because it's just a great sort of experience being able to practice applying your commerce skills as part of doing these case competitions. So I really encourage you to sort of don't neglect your studies, but do as many of them as you can along the way. And I think the essay competition is particularly valuable because it's the one case competition where you're doing sort of a public policy topic on an Australian issue. And as I'll talk about public policy, I think obviously there's a lot of skills that are the same, but there are some aspects of the case which are a little bit different. And some people are interested in the business side, some people are interested in public policy sort of. So this is a great competition for people who are kind of more interested in the public policy type of issues. Okay, so I guess some of you might have. Did anyone go in the competition last year? Or okay, so this is what last year's case was. Last year's case was about casualisation of the Australian workforce, and so this is what you were basically in summary form asked to do. You had to formulate a policy proposal addressing the following. Explain using evidence whether you think the workforce is becoming casualised, what's causing it, does that present any problems or benefits to Australia, and formulate a policy response to that. So that was last year's set of questions, and as with this year, you were given sort of some background material, you were given a whole lot of sort of possible references to read, and then after that, it was up to you. So what I've done is really sort of just structured my talk around just a series of points that I think is useful background to have in mind when you think about doing this year's competition. One big point I think is remember that this is a public policy not a business case study, and that makes a big difference to really sort of fundamentally what you're trying to do with your proposal. Okay, if you're doing a business case competition, then you are you're supposed to be coming up with a proposal that's going to increase the profitability of the business. That's going to make the business more profitable. Should you merge these two companies, your argument has to be made in terms of why it's going to increase the organisation's profits. Should you create a new product, again, it's about whether that's going to increase the organisation's profits. But with a public policy case study, you're thinking your objective is maximising society's well-being. The government, who in the end are the organisation that implements sort of public policy for us, that's the objective that we think they have in mind. That they want to introduce policies that make the citizens of that country as well off as possible. So when you're doing the case, the thing that you've sort of got to have in the back of your mind is that the whole of sort of your development of proposals should be oriented towards maximising society's well-being. So if you think about the casualisation one, when you think about question 3, does the phenomenon present any problems and or benefits? Really, the thing that's not written there is problems and or benefits from society's point of view. Are there problems for Australian society because of casualisation, or are there benefits to Australian society from casualisation? If you're doing business case study and casualisation, you might say, yeah, great, that increases the flexibility of the workforce, going to allow firms to do what they want, sort of more bargaining power, profits increase. But in a public policy case competition, the thing you've got to keep in mind is it's got to be oriented towards the issue of maximising society's well-being. Second point is answer the questions. So, this might seem sort of like a basic point, but sometimes, these are, casualisation is a broad topic. I know this year's topic on international trade is a broad topic as well. And so sometimes you can kind of get, you know all this stuff sort of, and you just want to show that you know everything you've researched on and that. But remember, what's really important and what will be sort of really evident to the judges is whether you're answering the questions or not. The judges will have the questions clearly in mind, and they'll really expect you to organise the material so that it's directed at answering the questions, not just demonstrating, how much sort of you've read about the topic or everything I know about this topic in general. It's really important sort of to direct what you're doing towards the questions. So make the questions the starting point for your research, and keep coming back to the questions in your preparation to make sure that you're answering them. So it's sort of an obvious point, but it's an easy point to sort of miss when you're under time pressure and it's a really big topic sort of. Keep coming back to the questions that you've been asked. Depth of research matters. The more research you do, the more you learn, and you're more likely then to have the best ideas, to make the best arguments, and to have the best evidence to support them. As I said, doing a lot of research doesn't mean you necessarily want to present everything you've done. You want to direct it towards answering the questions. But the more research you do, the bigger amount of evidence and arguments you're going to have to draw on. You're going to be able to, really choose the best arguments and the best evidence from a bigger set of knowledge. And that was one thing that was evident sort of last year. That all of the teams that made the final, really had gone to a lot of effort to learn a lot about casualisation and its impacts, and to base their cases on that. So doing the analysis, this is one thing where I sort of felt like last year there could have been some sort of scope for improvement. Make sure you have sort of what I call here a coherent story or narrative in your case. It's important that everything in your case sort of integrates or links together. For example, again, if we just go back to the questions, so question 2 was sort of what's causing the casualisation of the Australian workforce, and question 4 was about sort of policy responses. Well, if your policy response was, look, we need to do something to reduce the casualisation, it's important to sort of link the policy response you had to what you were saying the causes were. So you don't want to sort of say, well, I think the causes are to do with say changes in workplace relations laws in Australia, and then get to the policy response and say nothing about workplace reform and workplace relations law. Go off on a completely different sort of approach to dealing with casualisation. You want there to be sort of links. If you say something's causing a problem, then your policy response should go back and say, okay, if that's causing it, my policy response is going to address that cause. Or you might say, look, actually we can't stop casualisation, but we think it's having a bad effect, so we're going to introduce some other type of policy response, like we're going to provide extra government benefits, or we're going to do other types of things. But there needs to be sort of a coherent line of argument or coherent story sort of throughout your case. Another point, it's a simple point sort of, I guess, probably know already. If not, I guess you should be learning about this in QM1 if you're in first year. remember sort of that when you're trying to explain sort of why particular events have occurred or what consequences are going to be, and you're using data, remember sort of, causality is not correlation sort of. Last year, I remember there was one graph that one team used where they basically showed that there was sort of a correlation between the rise in casualisation and another variable. And from that, they concluded, wow, look, this is one of the causes of casualisation. And I guess I wasn't so sort of convinced by that. And I guess what I said to them at the time is that, yeah, showing correlation sort of is a starting point, but you also kind of need a theory for why, for why one of the variables, that other variable would have been causing casualisation. Because there's lots of variables that are correlated sort of just for accidental reasons. And so if you're going to argue that you've got sort of evidence about the causes of some event or the consequences of some event, showing correlation between data series is a starting point, but evidence, solid evidence really needs to consist as well of theory or a sort of empirical method that tells you that this is more than correlation. For example, if you're trying to explain casualisation, maybe you use regression analysis where you can control for a whole lot of other things, and then if the variable you think might be causing it, shows a significant relationship with casualisation, then you're a bit more confident that it might be driving casualisation. So I guess the general point here is just that, look, you want to make your evidence sort of, your argument based on evidence convincing sort of, rather than, make it as convincing, as in-depth as you can. Next point is how one of the aspects of a public policy case is always to suggest what you think a good policy is. And so, how would you make an argument that public policy is a good policy? Well, one thing that's really important is to be as specific as possible about the policy that you're proposing. Obviously, you only got limited amount of time. So and these, for example, these trade treaties and that are thousands of pages. So you can't be as detailed as the actual treaty in that, but I guess being a little bit specific sort of about what you would do, or being as specific as you can, is better than being sort of too general. You want to demonstrate that the policy solves the problem that it's intended to address. So you kind of, what is the policy? In what ways can we think the policy will solve the problem that it's intending to address? So remember, this is the point I made before about linking back. You want the policy to solve what you're identifying as the problems. And then this is the last point I made. You want that demonstration to be convincing. You want to use either theory or empirical evidence to argue that the policy will actually solve the problem. Don't oversell ideas that you might have. It's okay to acknowledge that there could be some sort of difficulties in that. In fact, I guess it's always probably more convincing to be sort of honest about what you're suggesting rather than trying to claim, push things under the table and claim that you've got sort of a perfect solution. Another point that's really important, I can't remember the exact example, but I do remember that there was a point that the judges were quite critical about in the final of sort of one of the teams, that they'd done a fantastic case of laying out sort of what had happened to casualisation, what the problems were, but then their policy solutions, we just thought there was absolutely no chance they would ever sort of get implemented by the government for political sort of and kind of administrative reasons and that. So it's good to be sort of creative and original in that, but don't come up with some proposal that's sort of preposterous that is never actually likely to be sort of considered in that. Make sure that it's something that's actually feasible and that might be sort of taken seriously by government. This may not be so much the case this year, but certainly it was an issue last year. Sometimes in policy, the right answer is that you don't need to change the policy. Like casualisation of the workforce, there are problems associated with it, but there are also benefits. And so last year I was really hanging out in the final for one of the teams to actually say, no, look, it's actually, we think that, that this isn't sort of a real problem. Casualisation, it's not increasing anymore. When you look at the data, we think we can understand why it increased. We don't think that it's really feasible to change that aspect of the workplace. Instead, maybe what we've got to do is sort of, just make sure that we're doing other stuff sort of through the welfare system or whatever to make sure that people who are in casual employment aren't disadvantaged. I'm not saying that that's actually a right answer, but I'm saying it would have been a plausible answer to the case. Sometimes there's no feasible policy that will actually solve the problem. As well, I think in policy that too often sort of policymakers suffer from what I call the IKEA fallacy. So the IKEA fallacy is, you go to IKEA and you see the beautiful tables and the bookcases and everything, and you think, oh yeah, that's going to look really good sort of in my house or in my study or whatever. But you forget the cost of actually assembling it sort of. And I think policy is sometimes the same. Policymakers think, oh, if only we had this industrial relations system, or if only we had this type of education system, and they forget about the cost of adjusting from the current system to the new system. For example, in the industrial relations sort of system, which is something I know a lot about. Every time you change the industrial relations system, it means basically the parties, employers and unions there's a whole area of industrial relations law where they no longer really sort of know exactly what's going to happen until cases go before, at the moment, the Fair Work Commission to decide sort of what the law actually says. So remember that there's going to be adjustment costs in making changes to policies that it's important to sort of think about when you think about how much to change policy. Okay, final points are about presentation. So presenting a solution, get the appropriate level of detail in your presentation and slides. So I think the right level of detail is when you have time to clearly explain each of your main arguments and when the audience has time to read the material on your slides. Last year I remember in the final, I guess I'm saying some things the finalists could have improved last year. Overall the quality was fantastic sort of, and we were really impressed by it. So these are kind of just things that could have improved it. But I remember one of the teams, a couple of their slides, they had about 5 different sort of graphs and bits of data on the slide, and so you go sort of everywhere as soon as it came up, trying to sort of work out, what's important, sort of, what is it all saying in that, and I think you really sort of need to distill down your arguments to the level where you have time to explain it clearly and comprehensively, and when the audience has time to read all the material on your slides. Because, being in the audience, I guess you guys know this from going to lectures and that, imagine if you only had time to write down or read half the stuff on the slide before the lecturer's kind of pushing the going through to the next slide and that. So, it's actually a good, use your experience of sitting in the audience and seeing PowerPoint presentations to know what works. Think about, when you've done your presentation, think about, if I was in the audience, could I follow this presentation sort of? Would I be happy to sort of sit in a lecture that had, that was constructed in this way? So what follows is, because you're going to know a lot more by the time you've done the case than what you can get onto the slides, choose your best ideas and arguments sort of. Choose your best ideas and arguments to make the case. you want to, as I said, you want to have the evidence sort of, you want to have the depth of argument to kind of demonstrate in a convincing way that you understand the material and that you've got a policy proposal that would work. But stop when you've done that. Final point is, just be professional in your presentation. Be organised. So stuff like know who's presenting at each point, know what's on the slide, sort of, and that. I mean, it's a little point, but yeah, there is, when you're kind of separating between teams that are often all very good, sometimes it comes down to stuff like the team who knew exactly what order they were speaking in versus the team that I'm first sort of, and then on this slide we've got this, and then they turn around and realise, oh no, actually that's a different slide to what I thought was going to come up in that. So know your presentation, sort of, be seamless in the presentation, be organised, know what's on the slide of that. Also, don't, sometimes people, understand it completely, sort of, because when you're starting out doing public talking, it is really hard, but don't kind of huddle behind here reading off the slides and that sort of, because you don't make connection with the audience and that. I'm not saying you've got to be sort of a, like one of those televangelists or something, getting out there and sort of saying, you must take my proposal and stuff like that. but no, you just, like moving around and sort of, looking at people, sort of looking at the judges, kind of, it kind of creates a bit more sort of, interest and life to the presentation. It makes the judges feel, for example, that you know the material well enough that you don't need to sort of, because one reason you stay behind the screen is that the only way you can talk about your presentation is by reading it on the screen. So point one, make sure you know it well enough that you can talk about it without having to stand behind the lectern. That's really important. But then the second thing is sort of, even if you're not standing behind for that reason, don't stand behind sort of because you're too nervous. Make the effort to move out and look at people, sort of, and point at the screen, sort of, to highlight the points that you want highlighted, sort of. That's an important part of sort of selling your arguments or persuading people as well. Okay, so that's all the points I have. Happy to answer any questions you might have about doing cases, or about what judges are looking for, anything sort of. Yep.
When you mentioned before about addressing the negative consequences of your proposal, would it be too far to go ahead and suggest we have this negative consequence, but a response to this consequence might be this? Or is that delving too far? Okay,
so just in case the didn't hear that on the recording, the question is, if you're talking about negative consequences, is it going too far to sort of talk about a negative consequence, but then kind of talk about how you deal with that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
No, in fact, that's fantastic. That's the best of all worlds, sort of, when you can actually say, look, a common criticism of this type of policy would be, X, but in fact, we can deal with X by doing this, sort of, or in this case, X doesn't apply because we've got these other factors which are happening. That would be the best of all worlds, to kind of raise a negative consequence, but then say why, but then to deal with it, sort of. I mean, just to say something else about the negative consequences, of course, it's important to get the balance right. You don't want to come out with a policy proposal and say, look, I've got one reason why this is a good idea, and I've got 5 negative consequences of it. So, I mean, then it's kind of a little bit unconvincing about whether you've got the best policy proposal, sort of. So you want to be choosing proposals where you can make a serious, convincing argument for why it's a good policy. But it doesn't hurt to acknowledge that, look, if the government was to come out with this policy today, there would be this group who'd say, oh, that's going to cost Australian jobs, or oh, that's going to damage our international relations with the United States, or something like that. If there are major questions about a policy that you're proposing, it's good to mention them. But if you can address why you think it's not an issue, that's fantastic as well. Yep, really good question.
Do you think cue cards or like electronic versions of cue cards are appropriate?
I think the best is if you can just know the material and presentation well enough that you don't need that. But yeah, I think that's actually second best compared to being behind the being behind the lecture, the lectern like that. If there's something like cue cards that lets you move out, and as long as you're not sort of glued to looking at your cue cards, if it's just a check every now and then, I'd much rather see someone doing that and be able to make eye contact sort of every now and then and move around and talk to people than be behind the lectern sort of. So I think first best is to know it well enough that you don't need that. But yeah, I know it's really hard when you're starting out, and yeah, like if you feel like, wow, the downside is that if I don't have the cue cards, I might have a really, really big stuff up and just forget it altogether. Yeah, then use the cue cards sort of, because it's much better to have that security than just go blank and not remember what you were saying in that. So, and I think the cue cards are, it's a big improvement on just sort of hiding behind the sort of the lectern and that. So yeah, if you're starting out sort of, and if that makes you feel comfortable, and if you're really worried that you might just go blank sort of otherwise, then I think the cue cards and that are a good way to go. Yep.
Speaking to what you were saying about feasible policy, from what I understand about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it actually forbids states who've signed it from doing certain actions in regards to their policy that would go against the partnership, I suppose. So do we have to sort of include those when we're talking about what, or are we assuming the sort of artifice where it's like we're about to sign it but we can make our last minute changes before it goes into effect or something?
I'm not sure. I'd have to ask the ESSA guys then. I assume it's probably sort of, that you would either sort of say, look, once this is signed, really we can't make changes sort of, but the question's asking us to say what changes we would make. Or probably an even better way is the second way you said that, suppose you've been contacted, the Australian government's about to sign the last version and they want you to advise on sort of what the, are there any really essential changes to make?
That need to be made before the agreement goes into effect.
But that's a really good point to, it shows that to be able to say something like that in your presentation, it shows a depth of understanding about the case that would be impressive to make sort of. Nina, did you want to say, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess like the second question sort of says that, assume that the government signed it. So I guess it would be advisable to focus mainly on, what can we do to mitigate that without infringing on those legal obligations.
Okay.
But obviously I think it's also worthwhile sort of mentioning that, in practice, we would like to do this, but we're not able to proceed because that would infringe on what we've signed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so just in case the recording didn't get that, because it's a little bit different to what I said. So Nina's saying, question 2 actually says that you should treat it as if it's signed and that. So I guess one approach is to think of other things that you can do apart from changing it, or you could sort of say, look, we know that legally it's not feasible to change it, or we won't be able to change it to the next round of negotiations or whatever. At that time, this is what we think might be useful to do then. Is that?
Yeah, exactly
okay.
right. Yeah.
Any other questions, or? So you're planning on entering? Have you started? So when's the first round due, Nina?
It's due next Monday.
Next Monday.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Well, I hope you all decide to go ahead and do it. Yeah, because as I said, it's incredibly valuable learning exercise doing these cases, a lot of fun as well if you doing the presentation and getting to work with the others in the team. Okay, good luck. Good luck.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Hopefully we'll get all your entries soon.